Welcome friends. So the other day we were looking at some of the luminaries of Indian writing in English. So we looked at people like Raja Rao, R.K. Narayan, Mulk Raj Anand, their works, the way Nizim Ezekiel would address the questions of identity and language in a very humorous way. And then R.K. Narayan, his very simple but very profound tales on the human condition, Raja Rao, and Mulk Raj Anand and his take on India and its poverty. But where does this entire or the earlier Indian writing in English, where does the tradition come from and how do we locate it, how do we situate it? So today we are going to talk about the construct of post-colonialism, the theory, the notion, the idea of post-colonialism. Okay, and with particular reference to our own Indian writing in English as well as South Asian writing and Asian writing to some extent. As students of post-colonialism as people who are more into research and readings, particular and broadly as students of literature, whatever literature you are doing, whether you are interested in American literature or Australian, Canadian or British literature or Indian writing or South Asian writing, you have to know what is post-colonialism and these are the key names. So today we are going to talk about post-colonialism and how it has impacted, what are the key theories, key names and how it has impacted the South Asian writing, the Asian writing, particularly where the colonies were, and also Indian writing in English to be more specific. These are the key names, theorists Bhabha, Said, Spivak and Bill Ashcroft, the Empire Writes Back. There are many more. I am sure as students of literature, you know or you have some acquaintance, some familiarity with these names. We are also going to look at what is a colony. India was a colony and these were the colonials, not just in India necessarily, but wherever there was a colony, particularly the English, the Dutch, French, Spanish, Portuguese. So across the globe, these countries had established colonies for a variety of reasons. So before we start today's talk, please look at this particular video. I am sure this video will help you understand the overarching concepts of post-colonialism, the overarching notion of post-colonialism. So please take a look at this particular video. This is a warm-up, quite a well done lecture where there are lots of key ideas and key theories discussed. What is post-colonialism? Post-colonialism is a fact or a state of being a colony. We were formerly colonized. So this is a state of being a colony. It is the cultural condition. It's a cultural condition that you are a post-colonial society, which means, see, this is a word that you will come across in day-to-day readings. There is no escaping this term because half of the world was once colonized or maybe more than that. So those colonies or those countries that were once colonized, they live in a cultural condition of a post-colonial society. That's what we mean. Now colonialism refers, as we were saying earlier, to the period when the Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, French and the British were expanding their overseas or their territories in overseas countries. Now these Western nations, they travelled far and wide to establish their colonies over a number of countries, a number of nations for a variety of reasons. Reasons could include trade route, to increase political power, and particularly and in several cases one of the reasons was to spread their faith. So three reasons for the establishment of colonies. trade, political expansion, and spreading faith. Three reasons, three main reasons. And what did it all lead to when they came and when they, so not just in India but also in Africa, also in um, parts of let's say Canada, okay, and Australia. So these are all post-colonial countries. Now what happened when uh, the so-called colonials arrived on the scene? There was exploitation of land, resources, and also local people. So an overall exploitation of land, resources, and the local people. Of course, the colonies, the so-called colonies, were created by subjecting the natives, the locals, to the Western oppressive rule and taking away their land, not just their land, but it had other far-reaching implications also. So, post-colonial theory, as we talk about in general terms, is concerned with the immediate and long-term effect of enforced occupation of not just the land and the resources, but also of the minds and culture of native people. How native people, local people were affected, and what did this act of colonization do to their not just to their resources, the economic resources, but also to their language, to their cultural, to their overall way of life. Now the post-colonial theorist enters texts. We are talking about, basically we are not talking politics, we are talking about literature. So a text, a literary text, and when post-colonial theorists enters a text, they enter it through a specific critical lens or read the text through a particular post-colonial way. Now that critical lens or post-colonialism asks certain uncomfortable questions and ask the readers or tease the readers who are us, okay, that so to analyze and explain the effect that colonization and imperialism or the expansion of power had or continues to have on people and nations. So whenever you read a text, always ask. And this is what, see, I am trying to connect all this to what we did the other day and what we are going to do in the subsequent classes. Extension of power. What does it do? What does it do, or what kinds of effect do these things have on people's mind and people's land and people's culture? So a post-colonial reader, a person who reads the text, would look for the effects, overt as well as covert effects of colonialism, and how they are addressed through the plot, setting, characterization, and language. Now, one of the key texts of post-colonialism is called is Edward Said's Orientalism. Edward Said's SAID. When you read literature with the perspective of Orientalism in mind, you would, for instance, understand, let's say, W.B. Yeats, the great Irish poet, and his two Byzantium poems, Sailing to Byzantium and Just Byzantium. And what do these poems do? If you look at, see, these are great works of literature, but if you apply the critical lens of post-colonialism, and this is what most post-colonial writers or thinkers would say, that these two poems combinedly, collectively provide an image of Istanbul, which is the eastern capital of the former Roman Empire. And how is that image constructed in Yeats? Okay, it is the East is identified with laziness, sensuality, mysticism, which is not the spiritual mysticism we talk about, the positive in positive terms, but rather the exotic mysticism. At such moments, Yeats adopts an ethnocentric, the so called ethnocentric or Eurocentric vision. So, these are other terms that you should know. And of course, you should know this concept also, the other, when a writer treats one race or group of people as something very different from his people, then you are othering them. This concept is also there, which is implicit in the works of all these theories, the othering. But we were talking about Yeats's, W.B. Yeats, his Byzantium, sailing to Byzantium, and we are talking about the concept of Eurocentrism. Please note down. Ethnocentrism. My way of life is better than yours. My race is better than yours. Those are the ideas that come through very strongly, according to post-colonial critics, in Sailing to Byzantium and Byzantium. So, what happens is you see the East, in Yeats's case, the capital of the Roman Empire, that is Istanbul. So, what are you doing? You are looking at the East or seeing the East as an exotic other. Which is a commonly established term. The other is not just a noun or sorry, not a noun, but a grammatical category. It's the other in capital O. Always you write it in inverted commas. So, the other, which becomes the contrast, or it is a foil to the dominant person or dominant race's own pursuits. So, you are othering. Now, Yeats, being a member of the Protestant ruling class in Ireland, so a white ruler belonging to the Protestantism in Ireland, he is a colonizer as well as colonized. See, Ireland also has a very tragic history. They were parts of Ireland, it's still being controlled by the Great Britain. So, Yeats, being a member of the ruling class in Ireland, has a dual identity. He is a colonizer, he is also the colonized. And when we recognize such double identities, it becomes one of the strengths of the post-colonial perspective. We have to understand the person who is colonizing us is also colonized by others. So, it's a very interesting reading. That's what the idea is. So, please go through Sailing to Byzantium and Byzantium. Yeats is an important writer anyway, with or without post-colonialism. You must take a look at Yeats when you appear for, and if you plan to appear for your English for competitive exams. Then another writer who is of immense value to us is the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe. The Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe. He published in 1958 a work called Things Fall apart. In 1958, not 68, but in 1958. Now, this work was criticized by one of its earlier critics or reviewers for affecting to identify with African villages, while Achivi's own education and his job was in the capital city of Lagos, which should make him, it's like, imply, identify with the values of the so-called civilization. Again, civilization in inverted commas, supposedly brought to Africa by Europeans. So again, I'm asking you to look at the dual identities. See, these kinds of questions may appear. The notion of post-colonialism or new criticism or postmodernism that we have been discussing now and then during the course of practicing several items that may appear for exams is just that this can also appear in some way, in some sort, for your exams. So it's good to know what is post-colonialism, but it's also important to know that if you get a passage from Things Fall Apart or Sailing to Byzantium, and if the next question asks that what theories do these works subscribe to, so then you should be able to identify. Okay, so that's the whole purpose of this particular class. People like Achebe or Yeats have been accused of harboring or having double or hybrid identities. So this is what is important. Now, the shift in attitudes in 1980s and 90s was towards post-colonial writers seeing themselves as using particularly African, Indian, South Asian, Asian forms supplemented with European derived influences rather than as working completely within European genres and frameworks. Okay, so they tried to, by the 80s and the 90s, people started from these countries, the former colonies, experimenting with themes and ideas, became more hybrid. Now, you should also know that post-colonial literature seems to begin with an unquestioning acceptance of the authority of the European models, especially in the novel, and with the ambition of writing works that will be masterpieces entirely in this tradition. Some of the earlier writings that we were talking about yesterday, they belong to that period. 80s, 90s changed the game for South Asian and Indian writing in English. So please remember, the earlier versions were more like modeling themselves along the European tradition. The theme, plot, etc. characters may be from our own native sources, but the model was essentially European. This is called the adopt phase of colonial literature, since the writer's aims and the writers that we were talking about the other day, the ambition was to adopt the form, and the assumption is that this kind of form has a universal validity. Now, critics often discuss the representation of Africa in Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness, or of India in E.M. Foster's A Passage to India, and also of Algeria in Albert Camus' The Outsider. So, one has to look at what are the representations that is being talked about. So, in your exams, perhaps this could be one of the maybe a descriptive kind of question. The Heart of Darkness is a standard text, an extreme favorite, a very favorite of examiners from any part of the world. So, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. There is a movie called Apocalypse Now based on The Heart of Darkness, and which deals about the impact of colonization in Vietnam. So, it deals basically with the Vietnam War and the aftermath of it. So, The Heart of Darkness, this is Joseph Conrad. Joseph Conrad, The Heart of Darkness. And then you have E.M. Foster, The Passage to India. And then you have Albert Camus, The Outsider. Camus, the writer of The Fall, most famously, Nobel Prize winning author, The Outsider. Again, critics have also found elements of post-colonialism in a work such as Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Now see, Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, at the time of its writing, at the time of its publication, I am sure that it's a post-colonial work. Of course, the concept itself was not in existence at the time of the publication of Defoe's work, but I am sure that Defoe was not even thinking of such ideas. Now, but critics today, like we were talking about, that when it's a new theory, but this theory gives us enough critical tools or ideas to approach the older, earlier, pre-existing texts. Using the theory of post-colonialism, we can approach the older, earlier, pre-existing texts. For example, we have what we have done with particularly The Heart of Darkness and also Passage to India. Now, what happens in Robinson Crusoe? You all know the story of Robinson Crusoe. A man cast off at in some after a shipwreck and marooned on an island for several years. And then what happens? Crusoe's attitude towards the land upon which he is shipwrecked and towards the black man, he sort of colonizes, who becomes his slave, and Crusoe calls him Man Friday. So, the man becomes his sort of a slave, and this is what happens to Ariel and Caliban also in Shakespeare's The Tempest. So, critics have done post-colonial readings of these texts. Chinua Achebe and Kenyan author Ngugi wa Thiong'o also have written a number of stories recounting the suffering of colonized people. So, you should know Things Fall Apart is a classic by Chinua Achebe, and another important Kenyan writer, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. If you have any problem with the spelling with my handwriting, please look these names up. You will find them. These are very popular names and very easily available. Now, in particularly in Things Fall Apart, Achebe details the devastation that occurred when British colonists began moving inland from the Nigerian coast, and he narrates the destructive events that led to the deaths, enslavement, ravaging of thousands of Nigerians when the British imposed their imperial government. Achebe points out the negative effects and shifting ideas of identity and culture caused by the imposition of Western religion and economic models on Nigerians during the colonial rule. So, all these works you can relate to particularly the early literature and writings in Indian English. Okay. Extreme poverty, in Kuli and untouchable in Mulk Raj Anand Suyab works. So, these are all the results of the imposition of certain way of life on another way of life. When we do post-colonial literature, we should also know the terms first world, second world, third world, fourth world, etc. When nations are questioned by critics because they reinforce the dominant position of Western cultures populating the so-called first world culture. So, this critique includes the literary canon and histories written from the perspective of the first world cultures. So, for example, a post-colonial critic might question the works included in the canon, because the canon does not include works by authors outside Western culture. This is something that has been extremely debatable for quite a while in recent times. The existence of the canonical literature, okay, top 10 books, top 100 books, okay, top 10 films, top 100 films, and the question is that why do these so-called compilations, anthologies, canons, they include works majorly by those artists and writers who are in the West, not from the Middle East, not from the South Asia, not from any part of Asia or the Indian subcontinent. This is a question. Things are now changing, but very slowly. So, what we have been talking about, post-colonialism, is simply a lens through which we study literature that is set in colonized countries or deals with post-colonial issues. So, when you approach early Indian writing in English, please think accordingly. Please make your own judgments accordingly. Again, going back to The Heart of Darkness, which is one of the texts which is continuously subjected to post-colonial scrutiny of late. It's a journey of someone called Marlowe through the African jungle in search of the European Captain Kurtz. And this mirrors Conrad's own experiences in the Congo. Now, this talks about European exploitation, and the book also deals with issues such as imperialism, capitalism, race, gender equalities that were very much at the forefront of the 20th century European mind. Now, Conrad's ambivalent treatment of these issues is extremely representative of the way they were treated in any number of European discourses of the time. Heart of Darkness is a text that can be used to understand how the image of Africa was projected as the other world. The other world, it is the antithesis of Europe, and therefore the antithesis of anything that is civilization. In other words, it is uncivilized, a place where man's intelligence and refinements are mocked by the triumphant imperialists. In order to understand more of these ideas, you should read Achivi's An Image of Africa, Racism in Conrad's The Heart of Darkness. And similarly, you can look at Canadian literature, which also deals with the idea of post-colonialism, contemporary Canadian literature, of course, highlighting shifting political, social and economic ideals, cultural ideals. It is necessary for students who are interested in the areas of English and Canadian literature to understand or to recognize the constructs of identity. What happens to the identity? What happens to the notion of affiliation or complicity with the hegemonic institutions of European colonialism or North American neocolonialism? So, what happens? And now, coming to one of the most important writers, Said, his Orientalism is one of the foundational studies of the post-colonial theory, along with Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak and Homi Bhabha and their works. Now these theories postulate that English culture exists not simply as the expansion of so called higher culture, higher order culture, but as a reflection of a massive enterprise of hegemonic, domineering influence and self validation. They self validate themselves that we colonized you for your own good. It was in your own interest that we colonize you. Now, you must understand that the designation post-colonial has been used to describe writing and reading practices grounded in colonial experience occurring outside of Europe, but as a result of European expansion and exploitation of the other worlds. There is a term called binary. This is the word: white opposed to black, good opposed to bad, savage or civilized opposed to savage. Now, Edward Said in his Orientalism describes that the West's construction of the Orient projects all the things, all the ideas that the West considers negative. This means there is a complete dichotomy between the East and the West. So, the West is good, enlightened and masculine, while the East is evil and dark and ignorant and feminine. So, all these negatives, they construct a kind of image of the Orient. Now, in the context of globalization, the problematic histories and political functions of literary nationalism, all these assume new meaning and urgency. So, we can therefore posit that as an ideal, for example, Indian or Canadian literature, they remain a vital site where we can locate discussion of complex socio-political relations. So, in the aftermath of globalization, that is important. So, whatever has been going on, writings that have been happening during the last 30 years or so. Okay, so let's start from the late 80s onwards, and then you will find that there is a very perceptible shift and questioning of certain kinds of ideas and models. So, these writers who belong to this category, they are no longer following the European models. So, the other day when we looked at the earlier writings, they were still adopting to the language and the model and the style of the colonizers. Okay, but later on, as we move on and in more recent times, we find there is a marked shift. So, keeping all these factors in mind, knowledge of native cultural traditions and patterns of behavior must be taken into consideration before exploring the impact of colonial conflict. So, this is what we find in most writings that come after, whether they are South Asian, whether they are Asian, whether they are Indian, or even Asian American. So, when we look at our next group of texts, we are going to look at these. We are going to look at them through the lens of not just post-colonialism, but also liberalization and globalization. Before ending, please take a look at this slide. Some recommended reading for you: literature and non-fiction, so Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong's The River Between, Ruth Pravar Jabwala, Heat and Dust, Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day, Ondate's The English Patient, Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things, and then also look at this particular video. Edward Said's, he is discussing his Orientalism on this particular link. Thank you very much.